Hello, everyone. Nice to see you popping onto the screen here. Thanks for making the time to join us this evening. My name is Michael. I'm the events coordinator and publicist at Annie Bloom's Books. For those of you who aren't familiar with the store, we're located in Portland, Oregon, in the heart of Multnomah Village. We've been around for 42 years now, and we are still going strong. Our store is now open for in-store shopping. Yay! You just have to wear a mask, and you're welcome to come on in and do some browsing. We're open on weekdays from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. and on weekends from 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. Our website is always open. You can shop at annieblooms.com day and night. We offer curbside pickup, in-store pickup now, local delivery within 3 miles, and various shipping options. I started off the chat with a link to the event page on our website, and both of the authors' books you can buy directly from there. We would really appreciate it. Let me tell you about some events that we've got coming up in the near future. On Tuesday, that's June 22nd at 7 p.m., Oregon author William Ritter will be reading from his brand new middle grade novel, The Oddmeyer Book 3, Deepest, Darkest. Then we actually have a little break for a few weeks, and Monday, July 12th, Dana Spiotta will be here. She's the author of Eat the Document. She's got a brand new novel that's really good called Wayward. And the day after that, Oregon author Kelly Williams Brown, she's the author of Adulting. She's going to be reading from her new book, which has a great title, Easy Crafts for the Insane, a mostly funny memoir of mental illness and making things. Tonight we have Joshua Henkin. He's got a brand new novel out, just came out Tuesday, called Morningside Heights. He's going to be in conversation with Tom Barbash, who's the author of The Dakota Winters. Let me read you about Morningside Heights. When Ohio-born Prue Steiner arrives in New York in 1976, she follows in a long tradition of young people determined to take the city by storm. But when she falls in love with and marries Spence Robin, her hotshot young Shakespeare professor, her life takes a turn she couldn't have anticipated. 30 years later, something is wrong with Spence. The great man can't concentrate. He falls asleep reading the New York Review of Books. That's nothing against the New York Review of Books, I'm sure. With their daughter, Sarah, always away at medical school, Prue must struggle on her own to care for him. One day, feeling especially isolated, Prue meets a man, and the possibility of new romance blooms. Meanwhile, Spence's estranged son from his first marriage has come back into their lives. Arlo, a wealthy entrepreneur who invests in biotech, may be his father's last best hope. Morningside Heights is a sweeping and compassionate novel about a marriage surviving hardship. It's about the love between women and men and children and parents, about the things we give up in the face of adversity, and about how to survive when life turns out differently from what we thought we had signed up for. Joshua Henkin is the author of the novels Swimming Across the Hudson, which was a Los Angeles Times notable book, Matrimony, a New York Times notable book, and The World Without You, winner of the 2012 Edward Lewis Wallant Award for American Jewish Fiction, and a finalist for the 2012 National Jewish Book Award. He lives in Brooklyn, New York, and directs the MFA program in fiction writing at Brooklyn College. I'll tell you a little bit about The Dakota Winters. That's Tom's book. It's the fall of 1979 in New York City when 23-year-old Anton Winter, back from the Peace Corps and on the mend from a nasty bout of malaria, returns to his childhood home in the Dakota. Anton's father, the famous late-night host Buddy Winter, is there to greet him, himself recovering from a breakdown. Before long, Anton is swept up in an effort to reignite Buddy's stalled career, a mission that takes him from the gritty streets of New York to the slopes of Lake Placid Olympics, to the Hollywood Hills, to the blue waters of the Bermuda Triangle, and brings him into close quarters with the likes of Johnny Carson, Ted and Joan Kennedy, and a seagoing John Lennon. But the more Anton finds himself enmeshed in his father's professional and spiritual reinvention, the more he questions his own path, and fissures in the Winter family begin to threaten their close bond. By turns hilarious and poignant, The Dakota Winters is a family saga, a page-turning social novel, and the tale of a critical moment in history of New York City and the country at large. Tom Barbash is the author of the award-winning novel, The Last Good Chance, which was awarded the California Book Award, and the short story collection Stay Up With Me, which was a national bestseller and was nominated for the Folio Prize. His nonfiction book, On Top of the World, Cantor Fitzgerald, Howard Lutnick, and 9/11, A Story of Loss and Renewal, was a New York Times bestseller. His stories and articles have been published in Tin House, McSweeney's, VQR, and other publications, and have been performed on National Public Radio for the Selected Shorts series. He currently teaches in the MFA program at California College of the Arts. He grew up on the Upper West Side of Manhattan and currently lives in Marin County, California. Welcome, Tom and Joshua.
Thank you so much. It's so great to be here, and I'm so honored to be doing this with you, Josh. And there's so many. I mean, there's so much for anybody to connect to in this novel, but there's, and we'll get to that in the questions, but there's so much that touched me in a personal way. But Josh, if it was okay, I thought maybe if you could read a bit. We talked before about maybe reading. It really begins with this marriage with Prue and Spence, and just if you could read a little bit from the beginning of the book when the marriage is, when they're first coming together and falling in love.
Absolutely, and thank you, Tom. I just want to say that I'm really delighted to be here talking to you. I'm such a big admirer of your work, and anyhow, I'm just thrilled to be in conversation with you. Okay, so I'm gonna read, as Tom said, just briefly from when Prue and Spence meet. Prue is a graduate student in English literature at Columbia, and Spence is her Shakespeare professor, and he's a young hotshot professor, the youngest person ever to get tenure in the English department at Columbia. Her first day of class, she looked up from the seminar table and saw Spence Robin, her Shakespeare professor, enter the room. He was only 6 years older than she was, but he was the professor, Columbia's rising star. So when she passed him on a snowy afternoon outside chock full of nuts, she glanced away. "Are you pretending to be shy, Miss Steiner?" That was how he addressed the class. Miss Steiner, Mr. Jones, Mr. Thompson, Miss Dunleavy, doing it with an edge of humor as if it were a mild joke. We do spend most of our day outside the classroom. It's not like we just materialize in Philosophy Hall. A gale blew past them, and Spence's jacket collar flipped up to his ears. His shock of auburn hair was covered in snow, and Prue was tempted to offer him her hat. But her hat was pink, and if she gave it to him, then she would get covered in the snow, and she knew he wouldn't countenance that. They seated themselves in chock full of nuts. "The coffee's terrible here," Spence said. Prue agreed, though she was inured to terrible coffee. She drank terrible coffee most days, often from chock full of nuts. Spence removed a packet of peanuts. It was an old habit, he explained, a product of his fast metabolism. He'd been so thin as a boy, he'd been sent to summer camp by the Fresh Air Fund, and when he failed to gain more than a few pounds, he got to stay for an extra 2 weeks. The snow was falling harder now. At this rate, they'd be skiing home. Prue said, "Are we going to talk about Coriolanus?" "Do you want to talk about Coriolanus?" "As long as you don't make me recite." It was what Spence did in class, saying that word recite with the same little ironical smile he wore when he called her Miss Steiner. "How about you tell me where you're from?" Under the influence of the coffee and urged on by the wind coming through the open door, Prue started to loosen. She was from the suburbs of Columbus, she said. "Sounds like a tautology to me." She surprised herself by saying, "You little snob." Little? It was true, he must have been 6 feet tall. "And what's in the suburbs of Columbus?" "Oh, just a bunch of complicated Jewish families like mine." Another tautology? "So you know about complicated Jewish families?" "I come from one." This surprised her. With his rangy, slender frame, his pale face, and thatch of red hair, he put her in mind of the Irish countryside. And Spence, she thought of Spencer Tracy, not to mention his last name, Robin. Well, you could have fooled her. "My Christian name is Shulam," he said. "That doesn't sound very Christian to me." In kindergarten, he said he changed his name to Spence. At 5, he became an Anglo-Saxon. At 6, a Francophile. It's the old immigrant story. I was trying to escape the Lower East Side. Well, you've done a good job. He was the youngest tenured member of the English department, the author at 30 of an award-winning book, a guest on PBS with Bill Moyers. "You're not still religious, are you?" He laughed. His paternal grandfather had been a rabbi in Lithuania, but his parents' God had been communism. He hadn't even been bar mitzvahed. One Yom Kippur, he'd gone to the Museum of Natural History to stare up at the great blue whale. She told him about growing up Orthodox in the Midwest, how she'd moved to New York to become an actor. So here I am, she said, as if everything she'd done, leaving Columbus, going to Yale, moving to New York to do theater, was in order to be seated where she was now, having coffee with Spence Robin. I can never be an actor, he said. I don't like to perform. That's not what I heard. His lectures were said to be packed to the rafters. People were up in the nosebleed seats. Acting is different, he said. I'm a shy man. Yet here he was talking to her, talking to this stranger. But then he stopped talking and she became shy herself. The snow had tapered off, and with the weather no longer keeping them indoors, she thought she could make her getaway. She got up and he followed her. That's me, she said in front of her building. And that's me. Spence pointed up Claremont Avenue. If I work on my arm, I could throw snowballs at your balcony. I'd like that. And then, feeling foolish, she wanted him to throw snowballs at her balcony. She rushed inside.
Oh, it's so good. It's so great, Josh. And I have to tell you, there's so many moments of connection to it. For one thing, when you talk about a superstar professor at Columbia, my parents were good friends with Charlie Van Doren, who was the ultimate superstar. And he was the one who had all the lectures, the young superstar who was the quiz show guy, and then when he lost his job at Columbia, my parents were living in Greenwich Village, and he would hold these secret classes in a basement in Greenwich Village where you'd get the great Charlie Van Doren, his lectures. But that notion of what it means in certain communities, the kind of status that Spence has, that idea of being that young and that successful, and winning those awards, the kind of aura that he would carry, right? And then
I gotta get it.
Yeah, no. So I was just going to tell you that thing for one. But did you have a sense of a particular person in mind with that sort of aura, that sort of, or is it based on writers you've known? But
No, it's actually, yeah. No, it's a great question. I mean, this actually, at least in a narrow sense, is my most autobiographical book to date. I mean, the Spence is based very much on my father, who was a big professor at Columbia. He was at the law school for 50 years, and he developed Alzheimer's, much later than Spence, fortunately, although, there's never a good time for that to happen. And he was in his mid to late 80s when it happened. He was still teaching at the time. And, I think the inspiration for the book was that when my father was starting to decline, and my mother was having to start to take care of him, she went to a class at the JCC on the Upper West Side of Manhattan that was for caregivers. And my mother is very much not a consorting with strangers kind of person. And, she likes to consort with the people she wants to consort with. And I was really struck by, obviously how hard the situation was for her, that she was really willing to talk to strangers and talk to people who she really probably had nothing in common with, except for the fact that they were caring, for someone who is in bad shape. And I think, I think one of the struggles of a book like this, like if you're writing realist fiction, as I am, and so the book is not speculative and it's taking place in contemporary time, you know what's going to happen medically. And, I always tell my grad students, don't write a story about a ball rolling down a hill, because the ball's going to roll down the hill. And I see a lot of stories that are figuratively about balls rolling down the hill, where you just know what's going to happen. Flannery O'Connor talked about how a good ending to a story should be both surprising and inevitable. And most bad endings are simply surprising, namely implausible, or simply inevitable, namely predictable. And I think, what interested me, people talk about this book being about Alzheimer's, but I kind of think it's really not. I mean, I think Alzheimer's is what sets the book in motion, but it's really about a long marriage and it's about a family. And I wasn't interested that much in, writing about what it's like. The book is not in Spence's point of view while he's in.
But what I was just gonna say in agreement with that is that it does all these remarkable things structurally that keep it from being what you said. It's sort of, I think that if someone were to describe it, as the sort of decline of this professor and then the marriage is affected by that, it might seem like a book that this is not, because what you do, interestingly, the book doesn't proceed and then arrive at that moment. We find out pretty early on that it's going to head in that direction. Then you pull back in time, and the engine of that, as far as I can see, is Arlo, who is this character we don't even know about his existence in the first few pages, right? It's we meet Spence, and we don't know for a little bit that he's actually got this son. And then through the son, you do this trick where whenever we get into this moment and we feel like, okay, this could be the next 90 page, it's poignant, but I don't know where the book's going to go for 90 pages. We go back in time and it becomes a whole new book. Like it has the trajectory goes here, stops, pulls back, and goes and there's so many surprises, I think, that are created by your decision structurally. Can you talk about that a little bit, I guess?
For sure, Tom. And I'm sure you know this yourself from writing your own books, that, your book is never what you think it's going to be, or if it is, you're in trouble. I mean, I believe, no surprise for the writer, no surprise for the reader. I wrote 3,000 pages and then found the book in there, and that's always how I write. And I think it's really important. I mean, different people proceed differently, but I feel I'm such a compulsive reviser that it's really important for me in the first draft to proceed as intuitively as possible and to not censor myself. So just to address specifically what you're saying, for many drafts of the book, many pages of the book, there was no Arlo. And then at some point along the way, I just said to myself, what if Spence had a son from a previous marriage? Well, I like to play what if games. What if this happened? And as soon as I started to write Arlo, the book took off. But I think you're really right that, Arlo presents interesting opportunities and interesting challenges. He's an interesting character because he's so different from everyone else. He's dyslexic. He can never live up to his father's expectations. He's largely, just to tell the people who are participating who haven't read the book, he's largely raised by his ne'er-do-well hippie mother, whose goal is to poop in all 50 states. And so
I loved her, though. I mean, yeah.
I'm not placing any judgment on her as a character. I think that's just how Arlo feels about her.
I think I knew her, so yeah.
Yeah,
but, yeah.
I think I did too. So anyhow, and then he lives for 2 years with Prue and Spence, and they're a pretty rough 2 years because Arlo both is desperate for his father's approval and is very angry at his father, and his father thinks that if only Arlo would bear down and study for the SATs, all would be well. But in any case, so one of the struggles with Arlo is he is a character who appears and disappears for long periods of time. And so the question really was, how to structure the book to capture that, to sort of to both make him really important and also have the book structure mimic his absences. And I think I've learned from Alice Munro that structure can be beautiful. I think a lot of my grad students think, structure, I do have to structure a story or a book, and that's unfortunate. But I feel like, no. Like, structure is an aesthetic thing, and it is, if it's done well, what you write when, what you tell when, is as important as anything else.
And Josh, I think this more than any book I've recently read is a story about the magic of structure. And so I did one of these things. Here's a name drop. I got asked by another independent bookstore in Menlo Park to do an onstage with Kazuo Ishiguro. And he said this thing. I was asking him if he got sort of blocked ever. And he said that he thought he had too much of an emphasis, he decided, on character, and meaning character independent of relationship. The most important thing is that dynamic. But what's interesting here is, so there's the dynamic of Prue and Spence, but then there's, what if we throw in this other factor? What if we throw in Prue and Spence with Sarah? What if we throw Prue and Spence with Camille, or Prue and Spence, with Arlo? And then we get this new lens on that relationship, like whatever, it freshens up everything, it just, because, and it must have for you as a writer, you said you added this thing, but wow, all of a sudden he's interesting, but Sarah becomes more interesting in her relationship with Arlo. I mean, and the last thing I'll say is I was realizing once I was teaching a bunch of books that there are these characters that you throw in and they change everything. And so, like, I was thinking in Sophie's Choice, like, it's not going to be a book about, but what if it was just Sophie and Stingo? But having Nathan in there, Nathan gets through Sophie's blocks and he gets through Stingo's blocks, and like, and Arlo is just going to cause problems because he's so unconventional. What, I won't give away what he does on his SATs, but he's got a lot of tricks up his sleeve, all of which brings everything to life. So
yeah, no, I think that's actually a great point about writing in general. I think, Tom, is that I think we want to get our characters into trouble, and I think I mean, obviously, I wasn't there when you were speaking to Shiguro, but if I'm understanding correctly, I think that I mean, I think that character and narrative, or character and relationship produces narrative,
and
are
produces character. I mean, he was saying those writing teachers who say, just make a checklist. What does your character like for breakfast? Like it's so much, your character is if you've got the dynamic, like in my book, which is this father and son book, as soon as I realized the power relationship between the two of them, the character then comes into focus. But to concentrate outside of relationship on character seems less productive. So
yeah, I agree. I mean, I think character independent of relationship and narrative is really a straw person.
yeah,
And that I mean, I think the relationship between narrative and character is symbiotic. We both create our stories and are created by them. And this is something I talk with my grad students about a lot, is that I think in part because they're writers and therefore they're watchers, and because they live in New York City and they get on the subway, and your goal on the subway is to avoid conflict, that they're just conflict averse. And I think you cannot be conflict averse in your fiction. Actually, what I tell my grad students is sort of imagine you're sitting on a subway and a stranger sits down next to you and puts their hand on your thigh. What are you going to do? You could scream, you could get up, you could put your hand back on their thigh, you could call the police, or you could do nothing. But in that case, doing nothing is doing something. Because
right.
when someone has their hand on your thigh, you're doing nothing. That's a statement that's different from just doing nothing when nothing's happening. And so what I'm always telling my students, and I believe that we as writers have to do what we tell our students because we can't be hypocrites, is that we have to figuratively be having our characters put their hands on each other's thighs. And so Arlo is the and I obviously I'm speaking metaphorically, is the paradigmatic hand putter on thigh. In other words, he comes in and he causes trouble. And I think Doris Betts has an essay called "Multiply by Two," that when you're stuck in your story, add another character. And I think I always do that. It's like add another character, bring something in that's new, and see if that new thing is right. Sometimes it's not right, but sometimes it is. And so I think you have to really be open to possibility. I'm sure you know that from your
Yeah,
own.
yeah, and my feeling about him is he keeps uncovering things. So suddenly he decides to get all the cousins in the family together, right? And then Stanley, this cousin and he hasn't seen, how long he hasn't seen Spence in like 20 years or
Yeah, a
something?
long time, like it's his wedding, 25 years maybe.
Yeah, and then but then he hears something that and he hears something new, but we get all this new material. We get a whole perspective. So how are we going to have access to Spence's childhood in this way? And from that, the other thing that's interesting, if you contact, and a lot of us have over COVID, contacted friends we haven't seen in ages, their memories are probably better of that particular time than ours because that's the last they knew of you. So they've frozen those last frames. We've lost those frames, So Stanley's vision of Spence is interesting, So
Sure, for sure.
I thought, one of the things is Jewishness, and I was thinking we did 23andMe. I'm 97% Ashkenazi Jew, but my name isn't particularly Jewish, and we were very Gentile Jews, even though we had rabbis on both sides of the family. We had Christmas trees growing up and Easter egg hunts. And, we had a similar sort of dispense, his sort of hiding of it. But my dad was very active. He went to Rutgers at a time when the fraternities wouldn't admit Jews, and he fought for that. So there's that. I was connecting to that. But how does that whole sense, it's alive in Prue in a complicated way. How did people's connection to Judaism figure in the just the sort of heart of the novel for you?
Yeah, it's interesting because it's not like it's there on the page constantly, but it feels like a really important shadow hanging over the book. I mean, just to speak a little bit about my own background. So, I mean, in some ways, my parents are the reverse, or were the reverse of Prue and Spence. My father was the son of a famous Orthodox rabbi. My grandfather was born in Belarus, and they came over in 1923 when my dad was 5. My grandfather lived in the United States on the Lower East Side for 50 years and never learned how to speak English. And it wasn't because he was a stupid guy. He's actually a very smart guy. But he just lived in the world of Yiddish. And my father,
My
first
great grandmother too just
Yeah.
spoke Yiddish. Yeah.
yeah, and my father, so he was raised in an Orthodox home. He went to Yeshiva University on a lark because his roommate was applying to Harvard Law School. He applied to Harvard Law School, went there, funded his way through school by teaching Hebrew school, went to fight in World War II. Toward the end of the war, when it was clear the Germans were going to lose, he and a buddy of his were unarmed. They were scouting at enemy territory. They came upon a band of 50 Germans who were armed, and my father, speaking what he called Teutonized Yiddish, convinced the Germans to lay down their arms. He came back to the States, clerked for Justice Frankfurter, was a Sabbath observing guy, wouldn't travel on the Sabbath, but was very private about it. He was kind of he believed in what Moses Mendelssohn said.
He must have known my dad because my dad clerked for Stanley Reed and fought in World War II.
Okay, so I mean, I just tell everyone, Tom and I were talking before about Tom's parents used to have. Well, why don't you tell the story about the parties?
Well, we had a apartment on West 77th Street, which is the balloon block, the block where they blow up the balloons for the Macy's Day Parade, and we'd have these parties every year, and we wouldn't have to invite guests; they just show up. It was annual, and so I wrote a short story about someone whose wife leaves him, and his character Timken, and he can't disinvite the guests, so he just has a big party and pretends that everything is fine. But it turns out that Josh, were you at one of those parties?
I was never at the party, but my parents were. My parents were at least one of those parties.
Yeah.
So Tom's and my parents know each other in some sort of way, but I can't recapture it. And it's been a long time, so it might be hard to figure out. But in any case, so my dad slept. He was Sabbath observant. But he didn't talk about it. He slept on Felix Frankfurter's couch in the Supreme Court on Friday night, so he wouldn't have to travel on the Sabbath. So my mother grew up in a home that sounds a little more similar to the homes that you grew up in, much more secular. And so they kind of compromised. Although my mother did most of the compromising, and so I grew up. I went to a school called Ramaz, which is an Orthodox Jewish day school on the east side, and I went to Camp Ramah, which is the conservative movement's camp. But then I spent some summers in Colorado, where I was the only Jew. But in any case, I feel like in the novel, Prue is raised Orthodox, but she basically gives it up and gives up a lot of things when she meets Spence. And I think that the later in the book when Spence gets sick, she goes back to synagogue to say prayers for him, and I think she really misses that spiritual solace, but she also can't capture it. And I think that's true of a lot of people I know who kind of wish they could be more attached to spirituality and to faith and to tradition than they are. And so there's a kind of way in which Judaism, I think, hovers over the book as a sort of longing.
Well, so much of the book also is, and it's interesting when these two people are falling in love, but it's also his identity is more fully formed than hers, and hers, she's from that generation still, at that point in which her career is secondary to him. And there's that poignant moment later on in the book when he's suffering from the first stages of dementia, but she asks him, and she scolds herself afterwards, but she asks him, "Do you know what I do?" And he doesn't give a satisfactory answer to what she's done. And even though she's sympathetic to him in some extent, it's alarming to her. And I guess what I'm wondering is, people who are talking about the book, it's anything that's about a marriage, and a marriage that emerges at that time, especially under the shadow of a Genius Award, because he's won this award. It's got to be about that give and take between women and men, and in the power structure in a marriage. Can you talk a little bit of that and the things that you discovered as you were writing all that, and were thinking about in terms of it, because it's so powerful on that level, and then when he loses his faculties, and then and the power dynamic completely switches. So
yeah, absolutely. I mean, that was really the essence, the emotional essence of the book for me, which is that I mean, there certainly in the 60s and 70s, but even today, but certainly then, it wasn't uncommon for women to put their careers on the back burner in the face of their husbands' careers. But, Prue is someone who went to Yale, who started a PhD in literature, who, wasn't really heading down that path. And she did head down that path. And so she's really someone who, for whom her husband's success is a big part of her identity. His success is her success. So when he loses his faculties, in a weird way, it's harder for her than it is for him, because he's not really, what happens in the book is that, at some point, the jig is up, and the English department chair calls Prue in and says, it's over, Spence has to retire. And in a weird way, that's harder for her than it is for him, because he doesn't really understand, whereas she does have her faculties, and she is really over-identified with his success. And so I think
Well,
that's really
she tries to say, well, he can keep doing it. She's like, nobody's really noticing it, right? She tries to buy him some more time. So
She does. She's delusional. In other words, she understands what's going on, but it's too hard for her to go there. And yeah, I think that she's someone like that's what the book is really about. Is what is it like when when you hit yourself to a star and that star starts to fade? What is that?
Well, Josh, it seems to me in some like metaphoric way, it's as though his work up to a point was like constructing a house, and the rooms are made up of all the books and awards that he's won. And then, because it's not just that moment, there's the moment with his agent, right, and the publisher when he's got this book contract and a lot of money, and what she does. I don't want to give away too much, but that's a sort of a mirroring moment, that's very, very, pulled at my heartstrings. So it was tough.
Yeah, it is a tough moment. And I think for sure you're totally right, Tom. I think it's interesting just if you look at what Prue and Spence are like. Prue is really proud of Spence's success. Spence, I'm sure he's happy about it, but he's kind of embarrassed. She throws him a MacArthur party, and
Yeah.
he's like, why'd you do that? Why'd you do that? And she's like, why can't we celebrate? We're among friends. He's like, oh, it's embarrassing. She wants to put out his plaques and awards, and he wants to put them in the
Well,
closet.
why? So, Josh, why isn't he comfortable with that? Why, why doesn't he enjoy that celebration?
It's a great question. My instinctive response is to say, well, my father was like that. And then you would rightly say, well, why was your father like that? I think he's like, I think it's a combination thing. I think he's shy. I think he's performative in the classroom, but I think he's shy. And I think he wants to do his own thing. And I think he's also a snob. And I think he's suspicious. Like just the way writers of literary fiction both want to be on the bestseller list, but think like, well, if I was really on the bestseller list, is my book any good? So, I think there's that kind of tension there with.
I see. I had a different read. My sense of it is it just happened too soon. That it was because it happened so fast at such a young age. I don't know about you, but I didn't. I was in my late 30s when I published my first book. So I remember someone saying that I didn't. We were talking about prodigies, and it was like, well, I think it's too late for you to be technically for you to be a prodigy, Tom. So I enjoyed it because it happened. I don't know I didn't have the burden that Spence had of early success. So
Yeah, and just thing you and I were talking about before, but I was telling Tom that I have a friend who's very smart, and she's done very well, but she never really got over being like the incredibly gifted second grader. She always says that she was great at the 3 R's. And I do think that being a prodigy and having high expectations, I think that's true of Sarah in the book, is that, she's the golden child, and, she does great in life and she goes to medical school, but I think she probably feels that she just doesn't live up to her father, whereas Arlo has no chance of living up to his father, and so he can kind of take a different route. And I actually think it's a good thing. I published my first book in my early to mid 30s, so a little earlier than you, but not significantly. And I think it's good not to be a pride. I don't think I'm telling tales out of school to say this, but I studied with Ethan Kanan, a writer that probably some people here know, and Ethan's done really well for sure. but it's a little hard to capture the hoopla around Ethan when he was like a 27-year-old.
Oh, who was
Uh,
he was Spence, so
he,
um,
you know, he'd gone to Iowa Writers Workshop and gone to Stanford and then went to Harvard Medical School. And he was a good-looking Jewish doctor who published a book of stories called Emperor of the Air when he was 27 or 28. That was much celebrated, and it was on the bestseller list at a time when like literary stories could get on the bestseller list. And that was when I studied with him. And he had, a huge advance for a first novel that he hadn't written. And I know it was a horrible time for him, and Ethan's done fine. I mean, we don't have to pity Ethan, but I think he would say, and I would probably say this too, that I think that it might not have been the best thing for him to achieve that meteoric success at such a young age. And possible your interpretation of Spence may be right. I mean, just because I wrote the book doesn't mean that my interpretation
right,
is
right,
better. It could be all those things for sure.
I'm much smarter about your book, Josh, than you are.
I actually think you might be. I mean, it's funny. I sometimes talk to book groups, and they'll say, explain to me, and then explain to me like what's going on, like
Well,
what do you think is happening here?
It's
And I
my
said,
book. I mean,
yeah.
my sister, so he's a guest on Bill Moyers. My sister worked for Bill Moyers, and it was when you on some of the documentaries, the Haagen-Dazs that Arlo is going to be sent to. I worked at the Haagen-Dazs of my first job on Columbus Avenue. And then the reference to the blue whale was my favorite thing in the world at the Museum of Natural. I keep reading sections of this book, and it's like, have you been following me around? So anyway,
Well, we grew up at roughly the same time in roughly the same neighborhood. So actually, I want to ask you this question, Tom. Is like because I mean, obviously, like place is really important to my book, and obviously, place is important in your work, and obviously in Dakota Winters. I mean, it's place. I mean, place is so essential. I'm curious, like how you look at place in your own work. Do you see place as a character in its own right, or do you see
very
it as
much so. Yeah.
different? So yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's incredibly important. People's relationship to that place. It's like their relationship to a father or a mother, and how, I mean, that with my character, with Anton, my character, I made this decision. I mean, he goes to the Peace Corps and has a near death experience, but it helped because he could have fresh eyes on the city that he grew up on. So he could be familiar with certain things, but also see things anew. But his relationship to the city was always important to me. And I would, I'd ask you the same thing. How, in your sense, what, or let's say, did your feelings, your sense of what New York was evolve over the course of writing this novel?
Yeah, it's really interesting, and I think that that's actually a struggle for all of us as writers. It's certainly if it takes as long to write a book as it takes me to write. I mean, it takes me like 7, 8 years to write a book. So I think one of the struggles, no matter what the book that you're writing is to make the book feel like it's all been written by the same person. And if your book takes you 7 years, you're kind of a different person over the course of 7 years, and your relationship to place and to other things changes. I mean, my relationship to New York is sort of long and complicated. Like you, Tom, I grew up I lived in New York, except for a year, from my birth till age 18. Then basically from age 18 until age 35, 19 to 35, for 16 years, I lived I lived in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I lived in Berkeley, California. I lived in Ann Arbor, Michigan. So I lived in a bunch of college towns. And then I came back to New York, and my then girlfriend, now wife, and I moved to Brooklyn. And so, I mean, New York has changed over the years. So as one example, like I grew up on the Upper West Side of Old. And so I grew up at a time when there was a meaningful distinction between the Upper West Side and the Upper East Side.
Very
That
much.
distinction is still there, but it's much more nebulous than it used to be. But I went to school on the Upper West Side. So I grew up on the Upper West Side, but went to school on the Upper East Side. And so I grew up in Morningside Heights at a time when I always loved Morningside Heights, but there was a certain kind of parent at the private school that I went to that didn't want their darling child to go to the West Side, and certainly not to go to 116th Street and Riverside. And I was the son of the professor. I was sort of like, I wasn't poor, but I was, relative to my classmates, I was the poor kid at the rich kid school. And, they had multiple televisions. I mean, televisions are, I guess these days are not symbols of much because people work on computers, but there are multiple televisions in their apartments. Whereas in my apartment, there was one black and white TV that was kept hidden in the closet and removed for certain PBS specials. So one day when I was in 7th grade, our teacher asked us to go home and count, I don't know why, to count the books in our apartment. And I just lapped the whole class. In other words, I had more books in my apartment than all my classmates combined. And I didn't know whether to be proud or embarrassed. I was 13 and I wanted to fit in. But all that to say is that, I lived in New York at a time and in a part of New York that's different from what it's like now. And then I moved away and then I came back, and New York was a much wealthier place. Certainly Manhattan was a much wealthier place. When I was a kid, Brooklyn was where your grandparents lived and went to die. Now Brooklyn is a different sort of cliche, where you can't, find a yuppie writer. You can't go a block without finding a yuppie writer drinking cappuccino. So I think part of it is like my relationship to the city has changed, but also the city itself has changed under my own feet. But one thing that's interesting, and I guess it's just interested in asking you this, Tom, is that so you, like me, grew up in New York, and like me, you moved to the Bay Area, but I moved to the Bay Area for 4 years, and you've been there now. How long have you been there for? 30 years?
Yeah, I mean, close to it. And also I was in Iowa and I was in upstate New York,
Okay.
before that.
So
But
yeah, I'm curious. The one thing I think about a lot is that I actually like to write about places where I am at the moment. But I know a lot of writers who don't.
I don't. I
Like they
have to
need
be,
that space. They need that space. Like it would be easier for you to write about Marin if you move back to New York. But given that you're living in Marin, it's easier for you to write about New York.
totally. Yeah. I mean,
Not,
I
not
did,
that way, but I know a lot of people who are.
yeah, I mean, I snuck a California chapter into my last book, but like, yeah, I haven't written much. I have some, yeah, it's easier for me when I've got distance from it. I wanted a couple things. I want to get back on the book. So I thought it was funny, right? I mean, there's something about someone who has a brain as finely tuned as Spence has, and that gets into Arlo's nature. But I really liked, isn't there a moment where Spence corrects him with the Dylan song? He hears "Lay Lady Lay," and he says, actually, grammatically, it should be "Lie Lady Lie," right? So it's very funny. But I remember when I was thinking about, I mean, when writers, um, uh, God, who wrote A Fairly Honorable Defeat? Iris Murdoch. Yeah, and I was thinking about the tragedy of her dementia. When you read a book like A Fairly Honorable Defeat, and the finely tuned brain, that just and it lives on in Arlo, which is interesting. I mean, that as Arlo's gifts, but there's a weirdness in Arlo, and I thought because we're here at Annie Bloom's books, there's a great. We were talking about this before. There's a section in Josh's book that takes place at a bookstore, and I think it's page 94. I was wondering if you could read a little bit to us, where Arlo makes some pretty interesting reshelving decisions. And I was wondering if you could read it and then talk about what you were thinking with that section. It's so odd and yet perfect, but I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about it, if you could read it and then talk about it.
Absolutely. I'm going to read just I guess the paragraph or so that you're talking about, Tom. And just to give people some context, Arlo's father, Spence, gets him this job in an independent bookstore when he's a teenager. And the bookstore is basically based on book culture, which is on the Upper West Side, where my father had his books for his class. And I think this is a weird dynamic where all the other workers in the store are graduate students, and Arlo is a teenager. But Arlo is the son of the famous professor, and there's a there's a lot of stuff going on among the workers. So this is what happens at some point in the store. Arlo had moved from hauling and opening boxes to shelving books, and soon books were being discovered in the wrong sections of the store. Someone said, "What's the catcher in the rye doing in sports?" "That's Arlo's section." Arlo denied having shelved The Catcher in the Rye in sports. Over the next 2 weeks, Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own was found in home furnishing, Graham Greene's The Quiet American in spirituality and meditation, Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird in nature, Henry Miller's Tropic of Cancer in science and medicine, and William Burroughs' Naked Lunch in cookbooks. What the farewell to arms doing in military history, someone said. Soon there were more sightings. Jean Reese's Wide Sargasso Sea in marine biology, William Faulkner's As I Lay Dying in Death and Mourning, John Irving's A Prayer for Owen Meany in religion and spirituality, and George Orwell's Animal Farm in gardening. Evelyn Waugh's Brideshead Revisited wasn't with the books at all, but was shelved instead with the bridal magazines. So yeah, I guess, it was a fun scene to write. I mean, in a weird way, the inspiration for that was when I was quite young. I don't know how old. I was reading reading Catcher in the Rye, and my mom said to me, "How is it?" And I said, "Well, it's really good, but I haven't gotten to the baseball part yet." And because I associate Catcher with, I was a big Mets fan, and so I associate Catcher with baseball. But I think more sort of fundamental to the book, I think there's something about this scene that really distills Arlo's relationship with his father. Is that he can't read well. His father gets him this job at a bookstore. He has this sort of cachet for being his father's son, but he's also pissed at his father, angry at his father. And so there's kind of a fine line between the mistakes he makes because he's not a good reader and he's not a traditional kind of student. The fine line between that and just, sabotaging things. And I think he doesn't quite know, and no one really quite knows, to what extent he's making mistakes and to what extent it's just the big fuck you. And I think there's a little bit of both in that, and that's true of him in general.
But Josh, I think he sort of does what his father did, but in a more productive way. I loved it, and I loved it. It's such a weird thing, but I really love, and it's something that as a novelist, right? That thing Henry James said, that a novelist is someone upon whom nothing is lost. And so there are a lot of people who will do big public displays of what great wit they have or irreverence they have. These are private, weird things that he does and not in view. And the other thing that I think is great is look at what his father did, after his sister had this terrible accident. He breaks into a house. I hope I'm not revealing too much. And he scrawls graffiti there. And so this is sort of Arlo's version of that. And he's heard about that. But what Arlo does is it's an act of rebellion, but it's fun. Not only is it fun, but it may even, I was thinking maybe our literary books they're just shelved together. Why shouldn't they get this extra, sort of like Arlo's doing? I'd love to have Arlo reshelve my books, and discover what Arlo thinks they're about, So I loved it. So.
Yeah, no, Arlo's an interesting guy for sure. And you're right. I mean, there are many ways to shelve books. I mean, I shelve my books in a boring way, which is alphabetically. But, I know people who shelve them by color, the color of the spine. I just shelve them alphabetically because I need to be able to find them. But there are many ways to shelve books and many ways to find books. And yeah, maybe we could all use an Arlo to come, reshelve our books for us.
So could you talk a little bit about, and there's one incredible scene, where he gets in trouble, but Arlo's relationship with Sarah, and talk a little bit about that dynamic, because it's important, and just, I don't know, your sense of it, of the two of them together.
Yeah. No, I think it's a really important relationship. And it's also very much about, presence and absence. As you said earlier, Tom, there's a while early in the book where Spence doesn't even tell Prue that Arlo exists. And Arlo somehow finds out about that. And I think Arlo feels like his family, his father, his sister, feel like he doesn't exist. And he is coming along to say, guess what? I exist. And then I think from Sarah's perspective, it's like, wait a sec. I've essentially been an only child my whole life. All of a sudden, this older brother, who's fairly charismatic, comes along and steals my thunder. And so I think, there it is in some level, it borrows from certain typical sibling rivalries, but I think the extra and important added layer is that, they're kind of strangers to each other, and all of a sudden they're not. And I actually think that one of the things that interests me in writing this book are the different ways in which, like, people who are kind of strangers to each other suddenly are not. So, you're talking about, Arlo and Sarah. But to me, one of the most important relationships in the book is when Ginny, the caregiver, comes along. And this is something that I saw a lot when my father was ill, and for 2 or 3 years there, he had full-time care in the home, and my mother was there and taking care of him. But there was a Ginny, and that is an incredibly complicated relationship because there are issues of power and class that are very close to the surface, and there often are issues of race because it's often the case that the sick person is white and the caregiver is a person of color. And I think when you're dealing with loved ones and dealing with sickness, there is the wish to think like, oh, Ginny is a member of the family. But she's not. She's actually a paid employee who is at the mercy of her employer and who has her own son and her own family. So there's that on the one hand. And then on the other hand, there's also the fact that, certainly toward the end of his life, Ginny is actually closer to Spence than Prue is. I mean, she knows him better. She knows how he likes his grapefruit, peeled. She knows his, the particular things he needs moment to moment. There's a scene, I don't think it made it into the book because, you have to kill your darlings. It's an important scene, but it just didn't make it. But there's a time when Spence calls out for help and Prue comes running in and Spence says, no, I want Ginny.
Yeah,
And
that makes total sense for me of being with my dad when he was sick, and with older people, that idea that can happen. And don't be offended if it does, but it does. And there's also, the Prue's not sure she can afford Ginny. There's that weird thing about giving Ginny the possession things and stuff. It was so, and she takes them. So there's this constant, I think a lot of people are sort of wondering where they stand with other people, and looking, there's that, and because there is that sense of there's something off in the dynamic and Prue doesn't know what to do about it. There's oh God, yeah. There's a lot, especially it seems like at end of sections and chapters, there's usually something surprising and devastating, that gets said or done. So
absolutely, yeah.
So I don't know how we're doing on time, but I know that Josh would love to probably answer some questions of people. I don't know if we can have them through the chat or if people just want to share their, unmute themselves and ask questions. Can we do that?
Yeah, absolutely. Folks are welcome to come on screen. If they type them into the chat, I'm happy to ask them of one or both of you. Any questions? Is that awkward moment?
We give people a minute to.
Here we go.
If they want to. Hey, Anne, how are you? Anne's a former student of mine. I see various familiar.
I'm great. I'm sorry to come in a little bit in the middle, but so great to see you, and so great to be hearing this conversation.
Thanks, Anne. Are you living in Portland still?
I am. Yeah.
Anne is a great writer who was a graduate student of mine at Sarah Lawrence years ago.
Oh, and now you get to grill him, Anne. So ask a question.
Sure. You can turn the tables.
I would love to ask a question. Is it okay to just
ask away?
Really?
So I can't wait to read your book, Josh. And my dad has Alzheimer's, and my grandmother on my mother's side has it. And something that I find when I'm reading what people write about the disease is, if you don't have a connection to it, it's often sort of a shorthand to just make it sad. But there's so much kind of humor and detail in it that I'm always really interested when I'm writing about this subject, because like the devil's in the details. So approaching a subject that's this kind of sensitive and personal, kind of what was your criteria for kind of checking yourself on those details?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I mean, I, you know, I just feel I like variety, and I mean that on a sentence level in terms of like cadence, but I also mean it on on a macro level. Like, and I talk with my grad students about this. If you write something that is simply sad, it becomes relentless, and then in a weird way, it becomes less sad. I mean, Laurie Moore is like a very different kind of writer from me, but one of the things I admire about Moore is how the humor highlights the sadness and the sadness highlights the humor. And, I mean, obviously there's a sad thing that happens at the core of this book, but I actually don't really think of it as a sad book. I think of it as a book where, there's some sadness and there's some humor and there's some scariness. But I also think that if you're, and this is sort of harking back to something that Tom was alluding to before, but James Salter talked about sort of, life is weather, life is meals. And I kind of believe that like in fiction, life is weather and life is meals, and you want to find the right weather and the right meals. So it's not always the obvious scenes that are the ones that are most important. For instance, I mean, there is a scene in this book where, and for me, it was a devastating scene because I went through it with my father. It's a scene where the scene where Spence is diagnosed, and this brilliant guy, can no longer count backwards by 7 or name the president of the United States. And that, you could say, oh, that's an important scene, and I guess it is, and you got to get every scene right. But to me, what's more important is like the unexpected scene. Like, for instance, when there is a mouse loose in the apartment, and Prue wants to do the sensible thing, which is, to buy a mouse trap. But Spence, this is relatively early in his decline, but he's definitely declined. He wants to catch the mouse with his own 2 hands, which is, obviously absurd. And also very not Spence-like, who is someone who kind of begrudgingly has a body and doesn't want, he's just not about the physical. But of course, this is a kind of substitute for the fact that and this, Tom is alluding to this, that the really devastating thing is that he can't write his book. But that's too hard for him to go toward. And so it kind of gets transferred onto this, like, do you doubt my physical prowess that I can catch a mouse? And she's like, you can't catch a mouse, and you shouldn't be able to catch a mouse, and I can't catch a mouse, and who can catch a mouse? But so if you look at that mouse scene, it's kind of both, I think, both funny and poignant. I mean, it's funny because you're trying to catch it, and he's like goes after the mouse with a letter opener, and but it's also tragic. And I do feel like if you can find those small moments that are telling and that are unexpected, that to me is where fiction lies. And so it doesn't become a matter of like, oh, I've done X amount of sadness, now it's time for me to do Y amount of joy or hilarity.
Well,
It's
also,
that
Josh, I think
sorry,
it's sort of what we were saying before, which, and I would say one of the joys of the book too is that the moments where the Alzheimer's is there, they're very poignant and powerful, but it doesn't dominate the book. And then the structural things where suddenly, the new generation is going, it's not Spence who can be controlling in his genius, and his success, doesn't get to control the narrative later when his illness becomes front and center. The book is still darting this way and that way, and has all these dynamic elements, that I think that Josh does structurally, and still, that the mouse thing we have so many mice in our house, but we have a cat who's been doing terrible things to those mice, including eating their head.
I'm terrified of mice. So if we ever have mice in my place, I'm gonna need to borrow your cat. Because my dog, I have a huge Newfoundland who's 125 pounds. He couldn't catch a mouse for the life of him.
If you have more questions or anybody else?
Or people don't want to talk, but they want to type their questions.
Yep,
Sure,
I will read them.
Can I jump in for a moment?
Yeah, please.
So, Josh, congratulations on this extraordinary book.
Thank you.
I
So I just Ari, you came to Ramaz in sixth grade, is that right?
exactly right. Yeah,
So we've known each other since that would be the bicentennial, 1970.
1976.
So
Long
we've known
time.
each other for 45 years. Okay, anyhow, I
Quite
didn't.
some time. So Arlo is distanced and distant from his nuclear family, and he's oddly drawn to relatives of his, oddly drawn to his extended family. Um, uh, he, as was said before, as Tom said, he initiated that sort of unwanted family reunion, and he's weirdly and interestingly drawn to his disabled aunt, Enid. And is this his route to greater closeness with his father? Is it meant to compensate for the distance between him and his dad? Can you?
I think in some ways, yeah, I think it's very astute. I think in some ways, yes. I mean, I'm not sure if it's about, maybe it's about trying to get close to his father, but definitely about trying to understand his father, that he feels like his father is inaccessible. I mean, that's why Enid, the sister, is, I think, is such an important character in the story, even though takes up very little real estate. And in some ways,
Mm,
really one of the hardest characters to draw. I mean, in part because, when you have, Michael Cunningham talks about how you have to think of your most minor character in your novel as a major character from another novel, making an
mm,
appearance in your book. And I think that's true in general, but I think it's true of Enid. But Enid, just to let people know, is Spence's older sister, who is a very different figure from Spence when they were kids. She got into a lot of trouble, and then she got into a car accident and was brain damaged, and essentially lived in an institution um, much of her life. And I think she's very important as a way of trying to shed some light on Spence's vulnerability and on Spence's childhood, because I think Spence is kind of like this. His parents were focused on Enid, and they were focused on handing out leaflets for the Communist Party. I think in a weird way, Spence is both like a genius and a latchkey kid. Like he kind of,
mm,
my dad was sort of like that. My dad kind of raised himself on his own.
mm.
Um, in a way that's sort of hard to understand. And so I feel like there's something about Enid that allows us as readers, and I think allows Arlo to try to understand his father. I think Arlo is always trying to understand his father and feeling he can't. And so I think Enid and Stanley are all those attempts. And then I think also, Arlo likes to be front and center. So I
Mm.
think he likes the idea of he's the one who's going to have the reunion. He's going to orchestrate it. He's the grand poobah. He's the impresario. So I think it's
It's
all those things. But I think
it's
certainly,
so striking that he's a latecomer to the story, Josh, because I can't imagine the book without him. And yet he's
well,
a
it's interesting. I mean, in my last novel, The World Without You, which those of you who haven't read it, it takes place over a single weekend, and it's a family reunion, and it's the anniversary of the um, death of the son. There are three sisters and a brother. Or the death of the brother. He was a journalist killed in Iraq, and for many, many drafts of the book, that's simply what the book was about. And a trusted reader of mine, whom I showed a draft to, said, "Well, Josh, this is there's some nice stuff here. It's pretty well written, but it's not interesting enough because it's just sad in the way
mm,
that you expect it to be sad. And fiction has to defamiliarize the familiar or familiarize the unfamiliar." And he said to me, like, "What if the parents were splitting up?" And
mm,
I said, "Oh, I thought about that, but I thought, I can't." I resisted it, and I thought, I'm going to try it. And I'm actually a big believer. And I tell my students this, that big changes at the roots of a story do much more than multiple changes at the branches and leaves of a
mm,
story. And so I decided to have the parents split up. Now, I don't know if you read that book, but anyone who's read that book, I think it would be unimaginable to them that the book didn't start with the parents, but that's just so much what the book is about. But
mm.
that came later. And so here, Arlo came later. And that's, I guess, a way of my saying that to me, 95% is about revision. I mean, my
Mm.
revisions are so deep that the book is unrecognizable. So I feel like, you have to bark up a lot of wrong trees to get to the right. I have a lot of tree metaphors here. You have to bark up a lot of long trees to get to the right tree. And I think, when you write for as long as I have, you get to the point where you put yourself in the right forest, but you're still barking up a lot of wrong trees. And so I think that, it just takes time to, and I'm sure you know this as well, Tom, it takes time to discover what your book is about.
Yeah, but Josh, I think you were benefited by both things. What I mean is you benefited from the addition of Arlo, but I think you benefited from the fact that you didn't see him coming, because the book feels like it's going to exist without him, and then he switches it. If you'd known all along, you would have set the seeds for it in a way that wouldn't have worked as well. I mean, the fact it feels that certain sections because he wasn't going to happen until he did, and I don't think he existed in their courtship, is what I'm saying. And then suddenly he's there. So
I think that's completely right, Tom. And I think that's true for all of us in our writing. Is that you can have a. I think I always tell my students this. It's like you can think it's fine to have a destination, but you better be wrong.
Yeah.
Neil Doctorow talks about writing a novel. Because you can drive from New York to San Francisco on Route 80. You start at the GW and you end up at the Bay Bridge. And Doctorow talks about how writing a novel is like driving across the country late at night. And you can only see as far, 100 feet ahead of you, as far as your headlights will illuminate the path. But if you keep driving, you'll get there. And so I think that that's what the process is for all of us, is that, we think we think we're driving on Route 80, but then, our car breaks down or there's an interesting sight and we head south and drive on some back roads. And, Arlo is both a back road and a front road. And I think that, you have to discover that along the way. And I'm sure that's true in your work as well.
Yeah, and I use that. I know that, Doctorow, and it was true. It's just, and Ethan Kanan actually even had there was some similar quote of just how much you want to see further than that 100 yards, but it often it won't show. It'll just keep you going. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Do we have time for one more question, maybe?
Yeah, if anyone has a question,
One or two.
Do one more question. How's that sound?
Anybody else? Sherry, Cindy, Jennifer, Ellen?
Or we can call it a night.
I'll be a question hog if nobody.
Oh, okay. One last one from Anne. Go for it.
So I'm really curious. So this novel unfolds under a longer period of time, and so kind of jumping off of what you were talking about with the last one, where it's just, it's a family, they're together, it's over a weekend, they're not always together, whereas this is almost the opposite of that, right? It's a family over time. Did your process of sort of understanding where the story was going, I guess, how influenced was your process by the kind of different period of the framework of time, I guess, is my question. And with this one, time and memory as well.
Yeah, so I guess what I'd say is that I do think you live with a book for 5, 6, 7, 8 years. I do think that every book is, at least for me, maybe not for everyone. I'm curious what you think, Tom. But I mean, I feel like for me, every book is sort of a rebound book. Like, you want to do something different from the previous book. I mean, I think if you look at all my books, you would feel like, oh, they were written by the same person. There's a similarity of aesthetic and voice. And yet, The World Without You takes place over 3 days in many different points of view. Swimming Across the Hudson takes place over much more time, but it's one point of view. This book is actually more sprawling in both point of view and in terms of time. But the issues of space. But so I do think that books are rebounds in some ways. But then I think beyond that, I'm just so interested in time and fiction, and it took me a long time to figure out how to structure this book. And then I was asked to blurb Joan Silber's, not her most recent novel, but her last novel, Improvement. And I keep meaning to thank Joan for this. And I can't even quite tell her what I'm thanking her for, because I don't remember exactly. I just know that I read that book, and there was something about the structure of that book that made me figure out the structure of this book. And I don't think if I'd read that book, 3 years earlier, it wouldn't have worked. And I was at the right time in the writing of this book where I was just, cogitating over, chewing over the question of time and structure. But, the reason I raised Joan is that there are these series of books on craft that are put out by Grey Wolf. And Joan has the book on time. And it's a great book, for those of you like Anne who are writers, or even if you're not writers, if you want to think about time and fiction. And this Grey Wolf series is a great series, but Joan's book on time is great. And I think, Monroe is so amazing on time. And just, the thing about Monroe is it's like an onion. You're peeling back layers and there's another layer. And I mean, the thing about Monroe stories is that they are never about what you think they're about. There's an incredible story called Miles City, Montana, that I don't want to go into too much detail, but you think the structure of the story is one thing, and then all of a sudden there's one sentence of flash forward where it's like you realize that the story is taking place many years later. It's always being told many years later, and the couple at the heart of it has gotten divorced. But that is not what's happening in the here and now. But you get one instant of flash forward, and then it just casts everything that's happening now in a different light.
I did the same thing, Josh. Yeah, my story, Birthday Girl, which was in my collection,
Right.
was I got the flash forward from Monroe. The same thing. Like, okay, because I didn't know what to do because I knew that was the ending, but I also wanted to show how this because it's this seeing how this death would sit with her. So I just go flash forward to this time where someone brings it up while they're getting drunk, and then it sits with her, and then I can go right back to that moment. But it is that way which is what I love about the way you're describing this. And you must be such a great teacher, I can tell. But the idea of like, what do I do? And then you're reading an Alice Munro or you're reading Joan Silber, and it's like, this is what I can do. This is how I get out of this ditch. So
Yeah, and I'm sure you must think this as well, Tom, that, obviously like teaching takes time and it's not for everyone, but at least for me, I feel like, getting the chance to talk about Monroe with grad students or talk about Silver with grad, or even just to read grad student stories. I mean, it was a particular pleasure to read Anne's stories because she's very good, but it's not like every person I've ever taught is very good. But I kind of feel like we're all in our own way still struggling with the same things. And, like Tom, you and I have been doing this longer than our students have, but basically we're all struggling with the same thing. And so I kind of feel like figuring out how to make a student story work, at least for me, helps me figure out how to make my own stories work. So
absolutely,
that's very important to me.
Yeah. Well, yeah, this has been such a pleasure, Josh. Your book is so terrific, and I love that it's coming out now when people can come to bookstores and they can come to Annie Bloom's and buy it, or they should order it online. But
Yeah.
it's and it's a good summer read, and would be good any season. But thank you for this. Oh, do we have something in the chat? Let me see.
Thank you both.
Just a thank you.
I just want to jump in and echo what you're saying, Tom. One thing that happened this past year, the book was supposed to come out in June 2020, and the Knopf Group decided to push it off for a year because of COVID. And I was grateful for that for many reasons. I mean, it's obviously much harder to publish a book in June 2020 than June 2021. It gave me a chance to start working on a new project. But most of all, it gave me a chance to meet a lot of independent booksellers. And I don't want to put Cheryl on the spot here because I know that you're here. But Cheryl is an independent bookseller she's actually worked. I shouldn't speak for you, Cheryl, but you have worked, if I'm remembering, in Seattle at Third Place Books, isn't that right? And then you also worked at Book Passage, if I'm remembering, and now you're at Bookhouse Stuyvesant Place, if I'm remembering, in both Albany and Troy. And so I gotta say, independent booksellers are the unsung heroes of the book world and for writers and readers. And what Annie Bloom's is doing, what all the stores are doing is so, so important. So I just urge everyone to buy their books from independent bookstores.
Hi, Cheryl.
Thank you.
Cheryl back here. So, anyway, yeah.
Hi, Tom.
How are you?
I'm well, thank you. But I miss you all.
Yeah.
So Cheryl, I'm right. You did work at Book Passage, didn't you?
Yes, 7 years there.
And I know that Book Passage is Tom's local store.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. We had good times.
It's and I've thought about you guys so much over the pandemic. It just seems so unfair. Because bookstores are what's so necessary for them are people coming in, people sitting down, having coffee, the life of the store, which, and for us, it's a big part of us feeling alive and connected. I don't know. I'm so glad to be vaccinated and done with this. So
We'll all meet again.
Cheryl, are people coming into the store for you these days?
Yes. It's picked up particularly this week with school ending. Families are coming in. And I know in San Francisco, Tuesday, of course, was the opening again. And and I've heard it's gotten busier there too.
Yeah, it feels great. I mean, and when met with a whole bunch of folks like outside at a bar, pub, food place over the last weekend, and just to be with people. It's great, and going into bookstores. So
terrific.
Well, I hope to see some folks in Annie Bloom's. And again, thanks so much for your wonderful conversation tonight. It's great to hear about all the process and the characters and all of that.
Will you post the talk, by the way, if I can send some folks to see it? So
I will be. Yeah, that's right. Thanks for reminding me. That's being recorded. I'm going to put it up on YouTube in the next couple of days. I'll send Joshua a link when it's up there, so you can share that.
And we can share it on like Facebook and Twitter and stuff.
I'll put it up on I always put it up on our on the event site, the same link that I posted there in the chat, so people can go back there and find it. And I'll let you guys know, and should be up there by the weekend at least.
Great, thank you.
On our YouTube channel, and that link is up on our website too. So.
Thank you so much, appreciate it. And Tom, thank you so much for such a great conversation. I really
it's a blast, and I can't wait to see you in person. We'll have to figure.
I would love that.
Yeah. So.
Okay. Thanks again, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.
Have a good night.
Thank you. Thanks, Annie Blooms.
Thanks, Annie Blooms.
Good night.